Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Lauren Pastrana, in this week for Jim DeFede. All week long, students and other demonstrators at universities across the country have been clashing with police, many setting up encampments and even taking over school buildings. More than 2,000 people have been arrested. They're calling for an end to the war in Gaza and also making demands of their universities to divest from any Israeli interests. But President Biden says the pro-Palestinian campus protests have not prompted him to rethink his Middle East policies. For a deeper perspective, I turn to Jacob Solomon, the president and CEO of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, as well as Samir Kakli, the president of the South Florida Muslim Federation. I spoke to them individually, but asked them the same questions. Here's what they had to say. The world has really been watching these last few weeks and really these last few days as students at universities all over the country first started demonstrating, demanding an end to the war in Gaza, and then they started making demands of their universities themselves, these institutions, now turning into full-blown encampments on some campuses. What's been your feeling watching these demonstrations grow and even get tense at some times?
Yeah, it's alarming to say the least. I want to share two different perspectives, if you will. One is as a Jew, and I certainly have to admit that I feel extraordinarily threatened by this. It feels unfair. It feels confusing to see Israel unjustly criminalized, demonized, held to a double standard is outrageous and frankly terrifying because we know where those kinds of feelings can lead, and we're seeing evidence that violence and anti-Semitic behavior is emanating from these protests. I also have to share that as an American, I'm equally concerned. I love America. I respect, cherish, and honor its democratic traditions, including that of free speech. But there is a clear demarcation, in my opinion, between peaceful exercise of free speech and the ability to share points of view with violence and intimidation, harassment, occupation, and certainly we've seen evidence of that throughout these student protest movements. I should qualify that. I say student protest movement, but I think it's very clear that among the people who are protesting and occupying and harassing are people who are outside agitators, who are people coming from all kinds of places with all kinds of agendas.
It's been mixed. It's a roller coaster. I am so happy and thankful to God that in America we have so much concern about the genocide, about children being slaughtered on a scale of thousands, about children being starved out, and our country is coming out against it. So that gives me like a lot of hope, and I'm so pleased with that. And at the same, unfortunately, at the same time, I'm so disappointed and shocked at the response in some cases, in many cases, unfortunately, from the establishment, from the law enforcement. Just a day ago, and right here in Florida, in USF, students were assembling in a peaceful protest, and they were met with violence from the police in riot gear, and they were met with tear gas. They were terrorized by the people who were supposed to be protecting them, and that was so sad to see.
What's your message to people who see these protests and deem them anti-Semitic? What do you tell them if they say that to you?
I think that demanding an end to a war, demanding an end to financial support of a genocide is not anti-Semitic. Protesting, demanding an end to this is and demanding, people saying that no business as usual because there's 30,000 people dead. This has to stop. That's what any person of conscience should be doing right now, and that's what those protesters are doing. Falsely claiming anti-Semitism, it's a coping mechanism for some pro-Israel supporters who feel that they see these images coming out of Gaza and they feel probably tremendous shame. How can you not, as a human? Anybody would feel that shame. But then, instead of coming on the right side and asking for an end to this war, some unfortunately seek to avoid the guilt they feel by claiming to be victims themselves and just making this false charge of anti-Semitism. They're not anti-Semitic.
Well, it's hard to generalize, and I think to some extent each campus situation has its own complexion. You see some where it borders on a mob mentality, and you see others where it's kind of a bunch of young people kind of singing "Kumbaya" and "Why can't we all get along?" I think the reality, though, is that whether by intent or by effect, Jewish students are feeling threatened. When you have people saying things like "all Zionists should die," or "Israel will fail," or "Hamas is right," there's a lack of clarity on some of these people's part as to what Hamas stands for. I think there's a painful and kind of bitter irony. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. Hamas broke that ceasefire. Israel and Hamas were kind of getting along. I'm not saying they were best of friends, but there was a status quo which was broken by Hamas's brutal, sadistic, almost animalistic murder, and the violence that ensued on October 7th is beyond words. So for people now to kind of naively say, "Oh, we want a ceasefire," when Hamas is publicly and repeatedly saying our goal is to continue to do this as often and as painfully as possible. Hamas wants more Palestinians to die. It's Hamas's playbook to have Israel respond in a way they have to protect their citizenry. Hamas uses human shields. Hamas surrounds themselves with hostages. If Hamas wanted a ceasefire, if these people wanted to put an end to the war in Gaza, call on Hamas to release the hostages, call on Hamas to lay down their arms, call on Hamas to accept Israel's right to exist. There would be a ceasefire overnight.
Instead, what we're hearing are calls for their universities to divest from their Israeli interests. What does that look like for people who are saying, what interest do these universities have in the Israeli government, and what would it look like to actually divest? What would that mean for the future of the universities and for Israel?
Well, number one, maybe these individuals calling for the boycott should look at their iPhones and their Android phones and delete all the apps that were developed in Israel. Maybe the doctors among them should stop using medical procedures and surgical techniques that were developed in Israel. Maybe we should stop using Waze in our morning commutes. I mean, it's almost a willful ignorance on a lack of clarity, at the very least, between good and evil, between civilization and barbarism. And the fact that our young people are so willing to embrace a narrative about Israel, there is the narrative that's being used and abused, I would say, on campus is that if you are the victim, you're automatically right. If you are less powerful, you're automatically in the right. The fact that these individuals have said, well, Jews are part of the oppressor class and Israel is a settler colonial enterprise, is just nonsense. My father-in-law spent time in Auschwitz. Both of my in-laws were survivors. For them to talk about Israel as a genocidal nation, believe me, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, they could do it in about 10 minutes. And the very fact that they're calling Israel genocidal is just a perverse, cynical inversion of morality.
And I think that's completely legitimate to divest from financial interests that are participating in occupation. Illegal occupation of Palestinian lands is a very reasonable thing, and it's something that's what the protesters are asking for. One example of that is, I believe, in Brown University. So they actually, that's a model that I wish other universities would follow. Instead of sending the police on the protesters, they actually negotiated with the leads of the protesters, and they came up with an agreement that they will have the student body come up with a vote to decide whether or not to divest from companies, that the university divest from companies that are involved with the occupation, Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. And they came up with that agreement, and that ended the protests.
We cannot be cowed. We can't be intimidated by the hostility that we're seeing. We have to remember that Americans are good people, regardless of their politics, regardless of their of religious persuasion, of their race, their creed, their sexual orientation. Americans, by and large, are good people, and they know the difference between right and wrong. And Jews need to continue to live proudly, openly, in a celebratory way, and to come together as community.
I thank God that, you know, we have so many young people. They're coming out and saying, no, this is not all right, and we're not going to stand for this as Americans. This is not what America stands for. America stands for freedom for all people, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian. That's exactly what the protesters are asking for, that everyone should be free in that region. Jews, the Muslims, whether you're Palestinian, whether you're Israeli, you should be free. You should be able to live with dignity and hope. That's what they're asking for, and that's an American value.
Thank you to both Jacob Solomon and Samir Cockley for their candid insights. From college campuses across the nation to public school classrooms right here in South Florida, the fate of under-enrolled Broward schools hangs in the balance. We'll talk to a school board member about the possible solutions next. Welcome back. I'm Lauren Pastrana. Enrollment is down at Broward Public Schools, so much so there's talk of closing upwards of 40 schools all across the county. Understandably, parents have a lot of questions, and they're making sure their concerns are heard at a series of town halls leading up to June's board meeting discussion. I spoke with school board member Deborah Hickson to get some answers on what this means for everyone in Broward. Debbie Hickson, Broward School Board member, thank you so much for being with us. The district hosting town halls to discuss future plans right now, specifically for under-enrolled schools. But before we dive into the possible solutions that are being considered here, let's go back to the root issue. Enrollment is down in Broward County. Why is that?
Well, you know, enrollment is down across the state, and there's, I think, a variety of reasons, but as most people probably know, the vouchers are really causing a lot of issues for public schools. Students that go to private school now have some subsidy. And, you know, it's affecting us, good, bad, or indifferent. It is definitely affecting our enrollment. And some of it is factors of people moving out of the area because it's just too expensive to live here. And also some people are just not happy with what's happening in Broward County Public Schools.
All right, so there are several options right now on the table. That's what's being discussed in these town halls. Some say, let's close just a handful of schools and then we'll repurpose others. But then there's a much more aggressive plan that would close more than 40 schools. That sounds alarming, I'm sure, to parents. They say, whoa, or is this my child's school? How is this going to impact us directly in our day-to-day lives? So what do you think it's looking like that will be more reasonable and responsible to do at this point for the upcoming school year? Because these changes would take effect pretty instantly.
No, it would be a year at least, because we'd have to go through boundary changes. So any changes that would happen would not happen until the 25-26 school year. And that's important for people to remember. But, you know, I think ultimately you have to ask yourself, what's the ultimate goal, right? For me, and I think for my board members, most of them, colleagues, is that we want to improve Broward County Public Schools so that we get students back, so that that enrollment isn't down so low. So that makes sense to change programming, do a little bit of different things for, you know, adding K-8s, 6 through 12s, things of that nature that obviously people are drawn to because those are the charter schools and the private schools that they're attending. So that's, you know, obviously one way to do it. If the idea is to shrink our footprint and sell off things and make money once, because, you know, you make money over and over when you enhance the enrollment because you're going to continue to get the money for the students. So, you know, that's a hard question that we'll have to, as a board, be able to answer. What is the ultimate goal? My ultimate goal is to enhance what we have, to increase our enrollment so that we're getting that money year over year over year.
You mentioned briefly there this idea of the K through 8 schools or 6 through 12. So that's kind of what we'd be seeing as far as repurposing schools. What does that mean? What would that look like for these, you know, elementary schools then becoming K through 8 centers? How will that work?
Yeah, and it's not for every community, right? This is really based on what works for different communities. For example, in Hollywood, the Hollywood Central idea, the community actually asked for that school, Hollywood Central, to become a K-8 because that's what they were looking for. In Hollywood, there's a lot of charter schools in that area, and the students were leaving the elementary around, excuse me, third, fourth grade because they go to the charter school at that time because they want their students to be able to stay there through the middle school. So, but there are some communities that don't need the K-8, so or the 6 through 12, and that's a model that's not necessarily as popular, but we have that at Millennial, which is now the #2 ranked high school in the state. So there's definitely advantages to that, but it really will focus on what the community wants. But it's not just about making it a K-8. It is what is the programming that you're adding to that that's drawing people in, because that's what we heard when we did the community conversations was you need to change and add to the programming in lots of schools. So, and having this conversation with people, there's two phases, right? One of it is the physical building and what might we close or how we're going to change boundaries. And then the second part was to roll out what programming changes will we make across the county in different places to make sure that we're helping those schools that are struggling a little bit with enrollment to have something that's competitive to draw people back from the charter and private schools.
I'm sure some people might think, oh, closing one school, combining it with another, more students in a school sounds like the opposite thing that you would want, right? Because for so long, the focus was student-teacher ratio. You want to keep it, as low as possible. More individualized instruction seems like the better option. But can you explain to people why that's not exactly feasible? Yeah, you'd like everyone to be one-to-one with a teacher, but first of all, there aren't enough teachers. There's not enough space. So that's why this needs to be remedied.
Right. And, Broward County Public Schools isn't the same huge district that it was many years ago. And we have buildings that are, they need a lot of work, deferred maintenance, right? So does it make sense to have all these buildings across the county that you have to air condition, you have to clean, you have to maintain, or does it make sense to do that combination? And again, a lot of the things that were suggested are just considerations. There has not been a final decision, and really that will fall to the school board on that June school board meeting that we have to make a final decision. But we did task the superintendent and the staff with bringing us some considerations. It was originally asked of us by Dr. Licata, you guys tell me what you want for the school board. And the answer to him was, no, we tasked you to do this. So, Dr. Hepburn was part of that and now has inherited what that plan is through him becoming the new superintendent. So these are just, we're reaching out, here's the ideas we have, and really wanting that community feedback to see, does this make sense? How do we shape it? I do worry if the June deadline is maybe too quick for us to be able to make those decisions because, now the community is engaged, and it's really important to have a lot of conversations on a smaller scale in those communities to find out what it is they really need.
I imagine at these town halls, specifically for people or parents who have kids at the schools that are, possibly slated to close, they're saying, okay, so where would my child go to school? When would all of that start being flushed out? You mentioned you'd have to redraw boundaries and things like that, but what if that makes it more difficult for students to get to school? Because let's say it's not in their neighborhood anymore, it's a little bit further away.
Right, and that's a great question. So that would be after, everything is just a conversation until the board votes on what is it that we're going to do. So you can't really have those solid conversations until the board votes on what we're going to do moving forward. But I know the whole point of some of the discussions on closures or boundary changes were the elementary schools close enough to the one that was being considered and able to handle the number of students that would be there. So the idea wasn't to increase your transportation budget, because then it negates the idea of how it's saving you money. So, again, it's all of these are just under consideration. There is no final decision as of yet, and we really do encourage the community to give us input so that what Dr. Hepburn has been asking at each town hall is, based on this feedback, they will look at what those considerations are, tweak them, because we have a May 14th workshop where we'll have, again, a bigger conversation on yes, no, what does this look like? Well, maybe this, and change it around a little before it comes to us in that June meeting for a final vote.
And just like the parents worried about the students, I'm sure the teachers and staff and administrators at these schools that are potentially, on the chopping block are wondering what becomes of us. Is the district going to work with them to reassign them to other schools, or will they have to reapply for jobs at other campuses?
Yeah, no, the way I understand it is this will not be costing anyone their job per se. There's a lot of retirements that happen at the end of the school year, and they would take that year where they're redrawing boundaries to also work with the staff to figure out what works best for them in the district, as well as students to figure out, where to answer those questions that you were asking. Where would they go? How would they get there? Is it a problem? Is there a possibility for reassignment? So there's a lot of, this is a huge undertaking, right? Remember, we're the 6th largest district in the country. So that's why I think it's important we do it in phases, although everybody wants all the information at one time. It's just so big that I don't know how you do all of it at once.
At the very beginning of our conversation, you touched on is something we want to do, increasing programs, stepping up our game, so to speak, at Broward schools to get students to come back, not just to settle for lower enrollment numbers, but to lure students back. Is there any sort of active campaign marketing the district, for lack of a better phrase, to the families in Broward County to get them to return to these schools, to say these are institutions worth attending that will give your child a wonderful education?
That's a great question, and I have been pushing for a different marketing approach for the district for the last couple of years, because that's exactly correct, right? Not everybody knows what's happening at these schools. For example, we had a school that won, Coral Springs Middle School, won a national competition in robotics. We should have been screaming that from the rooftops. It should have been, dead center on our website to say, hey, look at the great thing. And I could tell you hundreds of things that happen like that on a weekly basis in our district. So it is incumbent on us. I actually just had this conversation yesterday at an elementary school. It is incumbent on us as a district to do that marketing and not dump it all on the principals, because they have a lot of other things that they have to do as well. And marketing's not maybe necessarily their thing. I also think it's very important for us to bring people into our schools, right? To invite them in, whether it's realtors, if it's city commissioners, or different businesses, and let our kids speak for themselves. Let the students cook them breakfast. Let the band perform. Let a drama performance. Let them see the robotics that we're doing, or a debate exhibition from our students. There are so many amazing things happen in Broward County Public Schools, and there's a place for everybody. So yes, we definitely are looking at ways to increase the marketing, so that not just adding to programs, but also celebrating and shouting from the rooftops the amazing programs we already have.
Debbie Hickson, thank you so much for joining us and for your insight today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back after this break. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching. Join Jim DeFede next Sunday for another edition of Facing South Florida. I'm Lauren Pastrana. Enjoy the rest of your day.